First Things, episode number 41.
I seem to be lost.
And so you're working around the clock so you don't take time for yourself to feel like an actual human being.
I used to feel like no matter how hard I worked, I was just spinning my wheels.
Trying to be perfect, we try to have everything in place at one point in time, and you can't.
Hello, my friends. Welcome back to First Things, the podcast dedicated to practical productivity based on modern research. My name is Brandon Vaughn, and my goal is to help you apply productive solutions to your life to help you live with less stress, greater passion, and amazing results. Today, we are continuing our study on assertiveness, and we are in a 4-week mini-study of feedback in our lives, giving feedback, receiving feedback. We spent the last 2 weeks talking about positive feedback, both receiving and giving positive feedback. Now we're going to turn a little bit more toward the negative side, and I say a little bit more, and actually it's all about negative feedback for the next 2 weeks. This week, we're talking about receiving negative feedback, Chapter 11 of the Assertiveness Workbook, Taking the Valuable, Receiving Negative Feedback. And then next week, we are going to be talking about giving constructive, not critical feedback. So what happens when you need to give someone news that may not be very positive? How can you do that? But this week, probably even more crucial for many of us, how do we handle criticism? How do we handle negative feedback in our lives? As we begin today, I want to remind you of an old joke. I'm sure you've heard about this joke before, and it may be new to some people, but it shows the difference in how we can approach life, how we can approach the negative in our life. The joke basically concerns twin boys that are of age 5, and the parents of these boys are worried that they have developed extreme personalities. One was a total pessimist, and the other was a total optimist. So their parents took them to a psychiatrist. Well, first the psychiatrist treated the pessimist, trying to basically brighten his outlook on life. The psychiatrist took him to a room piled to the ceiling with brand new toys. But instead of this child jumping up and down for joy with all these toys, this little boy burst into tears. And the psychiatrist asked this boy, "What's the matter with you? I don't understand. Don't you want to play with any of these toys?" Well, the boy's still crying and bawling, says, "Yes, but if I did, I'd only break them." Total pessimist. So then the psychiatrist then turned to treat the optimist 5-year-old, and he was trying to dampen his outlook on life. So this psychiatrist took him to a room piled to the ceiling with horse manure, just stinking up the place. But instead of this little boy wrinkling up his nose in disgust, this optimistic young boy jumped up and down in excitement, the same excitement that the psychiatrist had hoped to hear from the other brother, the pessimist. And before he knew it, the psychiatrist saw this little boy jump on top of that pile of manure, drop to his knees, and then began with great joy digging out scoop after scoop of this stinking manure with his bare hands. The psychiatrist was baffled. Well, what is this kid doing? What do you think you're doing? And the little boy turns to him, beaming, smiling from face to face, and said, "With all of this manure, there must be a pony in here somewhere." And I don't know if you've ever heard that story, but it speaks volumes about how we can view the things in life, how we can see the great things in front of us, and we can take on a very pessimistic view. And on the other hand, how a very optimistic, more positive mindset can look at a big pile of manure and try to seek the treasure. I think this is probably, if I'm honest, the origin for what I said a couple of weeks ago about how there's always gold nuggets in life's messiness. And when life throws you a bunch of manure in your life, I say there's some treasure somewhere in that big mess that's in your life, if you just believe and will search for it. And I think it's important to keep that in mind as we go through some of the tips this week about dealing with negative feedback. Now, let me read what the author says at the very beginning of this chapter. He says, "It can be hard enough to hear what others like about us. Hearing what they don't like, what offended them, what disappointed them, what they thought was silly or beneath us, this can be almost unbearable. The task is made worse by the fact that most of the people in our lives haven't read this book. Most of the people in our lives aren't listening to this podcast on assertiveness, and that makes communicating with them that much difficult. The corrective feedback we receive is often aggressive. It's often vague. It's often designed for purposes other than to help us out. Most of us don't like to be criticized. I would love to see a show of hands of anyone listening to my voice today. How many of you just love to be criticized, unjustly criticized at that? I don't think many of us would have our hands raised right now. Criticism is almost unavoidable. However, the only way to live a life without criticism is to hide away in a cave and never see anyone. If you are around other people, sooner or later, you're going to receive some negative feedback in your life. Now, this may sound a very pessimistic approach of life, but I don't think it's pessimistic in a negative sense. I think it's just reality. We live in a world of people who have their own agendas, who have these dominant communication styles in aggression or passive aggressive or past styles, and we deal with them on a daily basis. And I've often said before, many episodes ago, when we are so dominated by what people think about us, the simple truth is that most people aren't thinking about you. They're thinking about themselves. And even when they judge you, even when they criticize you, often they are reflecting upon themselves, either trying to build themselves up or to try to make themselves feel better and hoping that putting someone else down can lift them up in some crazy psychological way. I think it would really surprise us if we could actually hear the thoughts of people who are criticizing us. I think we would be astonished of how insecure they are in themselves. When people are judgmental of you, when they criticize you, you take that many times, as I do, and I'm speaking of myself in volumes here, I take it as the basis of my identity. This is who I am in life because you said this was true of me. And we never question it. It always goes back to this idea of stinking thinking I've said over and over again on these episodes, and how many times people implant thoughts into our lives because of being critical to us, and we take those thoughts and never challenge them. Why are you telling me this? Is there any merit and truth in there? Is there anything in there? Is there any of this gold nugget that I can take and apply to my life and be a better person? And that may mean that 99.9% of what you just told me, and particularly how you told me, is absolute crap. It's absolute junk. And I don't need this. I'm not going to receive it. I'm not going to take it. But on this one minute point, yes, I see a little bit of treasure there, and I'm going to apply that to my life. Thank you very much, Mr. Critical Judgmental Teacher, for the lesson you've given me in my life. Now I'm discarding 99.9% of else of what you've said in my life. But we don't do that many times. We internalize everything that they say, all the feelings, and we go away feeling like we're worthless, like we don't matter in this life, as if we're one more sign of how worthless I am in this life. This person has just again validated why I don't matter in this life. I knew I was nothing in this life, and now they've just added more evidence, more concrete evidence of that, instead of pushing back and saying, no, I'm not going to always take your criticism. I'm not always going to internalize your garbage that you're trying to impose into my life. Now, many of us would never allow people to just pollute things in our life. I mean, imagine that for some crazy reason, your neighbor said, you know, I hate that I'm polluting the environment by using my car. And what I thought I would do is to channel all of that exhaust when I start my car somewhere. And so I'd like to just pipe that pollution into your garage. Would you mind if I just took a pipe and stuck it to my exhaust of my car and just piped it into your house so that it could absorb all of these pollutants and it wouldn't get into the air nearly as much? Would that be okay with you? Now, how many of us would say, sure, pipe that pollution right in my house, buddy. I love that. I love that you're taking care of the environment, and just give it all to me. I'll take it all. We would sit there and say, no, are you crazy? I'm not going to take any of that stuff. That could kill me. That could harm me. But we do that all of the time with people's thoughts and their emotions. They come to us. People come to us and explode on us all sorts of poison and negativity, and we just sit there and take it. Many of us do. We just sit there and say, sure, pipe your poison right into my life. And you say, well, what am I supposed to do? Well, we're going to talk about that in this episode. The big thing is, though, big secret is that sometimes you just have to push them away. Sometimes you have to walk away. You have to give yourself dignity to stand up for yourself and say, listen, I don't need this in my life. I'm not going to take this in my life. But a big secret that I have found many times that I wish I was taught at an early age is you can sit around people and not receive the negativity. Sometimes it's hard. Sometimes you just have to get away from people. You have to distance yourself from people. But there is a way to sit around a person and push that negativity away. Now, it takes practice sometimes, and quite frankly, again, there are some people in this life that it is very hard to push away their negativity. I don't know if you've ever been around a person like this, that just being around them makes you feel depressed and it makes you feel down because their whole life is so absorbed with that. Now, I do think you can stand your ground emotionally and not take that onto yourself, but it can be very hard. And if you're around them all of the time, it becomes almost impossible. People's emotional status will kind of wear on you if you stay too long around them. But I do think you can push away. Now, at the same time, we have to remember that negative feedback is still feedback. And getting feedback every now and then is very helpful because feedback can be very much like a mirror. It can show us ourselves. The problem is that often that mirror can be very inaccurate representations of who we are. A very good mirror, I don't know if you've ever been to a carnival and you've seen some of those funny mirrors that make you look really skinny or really fat. And you should think of those mirrors as what criticism is in your life. They can be a very distorted picture of who you are. And therefore, if you use that as the basis of your identity, you're in a very bad state. You cannot let criticism be the basis of your identity. But at the same time, I want you to realize that it's still a mirror. Even though it's distorted, even though it's inaccurate, it is still a mirror in your life. And it can give some truth that maybe you didn't see before. Like, for instance, I remember one time being at one of these carnivals, and I was looking at all these mirrors, and one of them made my head as big as it seemed like a water tower. I mean, it was huge. My head was like 5 feet big and wide, and I knew that wasn't the way I looked. But when I looked at that, I realized, oh, wow, I really need a haircut. I saw that very well, and I could have seen that in a regular mirror, but when my head is like 5 feet big, I could really see that I needed a haircut. So there was an element of truth, even though it might have been minute, and it was an over-exaggeration, it was completely inaccurate of how I actually looked, I still was able to gain some benefit from that. I had to toss out basically everything else of how I looked, everything else of how it seemed. I could have gone away thinking, man, I've got the biggest head on this earth. I just am a freak of nature. This is how I look. But I went away saying, no, I know that's not how I look. I know how I look. I've seen myself in a regular mirror, and therefore I'm not going to go around moping and thinking, man, I've just got this big head, and people are going to stare at me and think I'm weird because I've got this huge 5-foot head. No, but many of us do that with criticism. We'll take that criticism and we will internalize it, that distorted picture of who we are, that inaccurate picture, and we'll say, this is who I am. We'll start basing our identity off of this. In fact, many of us who suffer from self-worth issues, that has often come from distorted mirrors that we had when we were growing up, sometimes from our parents. Mom or dad was extremely critical of us, maybe even abusive of us, or were emotionally distant from us, or had a state of perfection that we never could attain. And this was the distorted carnival mirror that was in front of you when you were growing up. Or it could have been your siblings or grandparents or a teacher or friends in elementary school or middle school or high school. And they were nothing but a very distorted carnival mirror in front of your life. And you hung around them enough to where you started saying, that's who I am. I'm just this person that has this 5-foot big head. And you walk around in life thinking that's who you are, and it's not who you are. It's just been how you were raised to see yourself. As the author says, there's many things that distort this picture that we get. One of them is just the mood of the person. They're just upset. They take their anger, their frustration with themselves, and they basically toss it onto someone else, that being you or me. They have unrealistic standards. As we said, you may have been raised with a mom or dad that had these perfection standards, and we never could live up to them. And therefore, we grew up basically thinking we were nothing but a failure because we never will amount to these standards. This can be especially true sometimes, even in a subconscious way, when you were raised with parents who were highly successful, and all of a sudden you judge yourself by how likely you are to attain their type of status. Some people just control and try to control us in what they do. So criticism is just a secret weapon to try to control other people's behavior. Sometimes people are just jealous. They feel inadequate in themselves. And criticism is a way to knock somebody down and to try to feel like they're elevated in some fashion. Could just be frustration. Many people are very frustrated in life, frustrated with themselves, frustrated with their environment, and therefore they turn around and toss that onto other people, and many people then internalize that. And also just plain out fear. We fear other people, we fear rejection, we fear failure, we fear death, we fear all of these things in our lives, and therefore it comes out as criticism because we're trying to find some sense in life, and sometimes maybe the person that is being criticized is seen as a threat, is seen as standing in the way of them coming to this consensus of life. I was just getting to the point where I felt like I had control of my life. I felt like I was accepted, and you messed this up for me, and therefore I'm lashing out at you to basically blame you for my lack of feeling in control in life. Now, the author talks about different forms of criticism, how we actually experience criticism in our lives. And I found this section to be fairly interesting. The first one that we're probably very familiar with is nonverbal criticism. And this goes back to our whole lesson we learned with Vanessa Van Edwards on body language. We will experience criticism many, 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 many times nonverbally. Someone will frown at us. Someone will look away or look disgusted. They will roll their eyes. How many times have you seen people roll their eyes in a meeting with you or someone else? Or they will tap their fingers impatiently. They will be very restless and they will jostle back and forth. They will breathe real heavily, like type of thing. They will walk away from you. They will do all of these things, but they never say anything. It is all in how they look at you, how they're expressing their face. In fact, Vanessa does a great job talking about people's facial expressions. And she talks about, I believe, is it 6 or 7 different types of facial expressions? And one of them is disgust, and one of them is happiness, and so forth. And it's very fascinating. Again, I would highly encourage that you check out some of her resources if you haven't, because it's really a good technique. I can't really teach it via a podcast. You almost really need to see it and see examples of this, see it in a video. I think it would help out tremendously to be able to pick up when people are kind of disgusted with you, not angry with you. There's another kind of facial expression for anger. We're talking about contempt or disgust. It's very subtle, but people do certain things with their face when they are in contempt or disgust rather than anger. People love nonverbal criticism. The author mentions this because they can deny it. A person says, "Oh, you're angry," and they'll say, "No, I'm not angry. I never did. I say something in which I was angry?" Well, no, but you kind of looked like you were upset. "Oh, I wasn't. I was just thinking about something." People can deny their feelings or what they're thinking if they don't say anything. And all the while they're doing that, what is it doing to you when you're around a person that is frowning and looks somewhat disgusted or looks impatient or they're rolling their eyes? What does that make you feel like? Well, it makes you feel anxious. It makes you feel down. It makes you feel insulted. And do you realize that basically what this is? When someone uses nonverbal criticism on you or you use it on someone else, this is nothing but passive-aggressive behavior. It's nothing but passive-aggressive communication. Because remember what passive-aggressive is doing. It is basically trying to control someone, but it's doing it in a nonverbal way. It's doing it in a very subtle, passive way. I'm not going to make a spectacle of this whole thing. I'm not going to have fireworks going off. I'm going to do it in a very quiet manner, and I'm going to be very aggressive to you, and I'm going to try to control you in some way, but I'm going to try to control you in a very quiet, nonverbal way. And this is basically what happens when people are doing these types of nonverbal communications to us. Another style is indirect criticism. It's kind of similar to the nonverbal criticism, but in this type of criticism, it's actually something that people do say. One of those is what we mentioned in previous weeks. It's one of these kind of backhanded compliments. And I actually did this the other week. I'm kind of ashamed to admit this, but I was very frustrated with someone. I was helping them develop some type of training materials, and I came up with all these types of discussion questions and said, here's kind of how I would phrase this. I would say it like this, and I think this is better. And then they came back and they were critical of me. And they were like, well, I think this is too hard, and I don't think this is good and that, and I think that you shouldn't ask such specific things. And I responded, I realize, with a very indirect criticism. I said this. I said, well, you may have a point, and if you want to use something more vague and open-ended, then it's quite fine. Now, what was an indirect criticism in that whole statement was when I said it was vague. Because when I said that, honestly, it was a criticism. I was saying, if you want to ask some silly, vague question that no one's going to understand, then feel free. There was a compliment there. If you want to ask more open-ended questions, well, it was maybe a compliment, but it was kind of a neutral statement. But in that statement, yes, if you want to ask more open-ended questions, I'm okay with that. I inserted a little criticism. Yes, if you want to ask more vague, open-ended questions, I'm okay with it. Do you see that? Can you pick up the criticism in there? That simple little twist to what I said. Very passively, in a way, kind of a passive-aggressive approach to criticism. Again, I'm saying something. The author gives these examples in the book, statements that people would say. Stripes look good on you. They're so slimming. Or how about this? How brave of you to do a presentation on a topic you're so unfamiliar with. How about this one? I love your innocent and unsophisticated approach to art. You see how that's a compliment, but it's not? It's a criticism. And the last one, he says, your project actually worked reasonably well despite everything. I've heard these so many times from people. And like I said, I'm ashamed to admit, I just did this last week. I did this backhanded type of compliment. And then he also mentions this kind of indirect compliment or criticism in which you say something like, lawyers are just scum. Oh, wait, you're a lawyer, aren't you? People only buy a house in that neighborhood if they're trying to impress someone. Oh, but wait, you live in that neighborhood, don't you? You see that this is basically an opportunity to jab someone. It's an indirect criticism. It's a very passive-aggressive approach. And this is something that people use quite a bit. You have to really watch out for these types of things because they are all over the place. Then there is just the plain vanilla hostile criticism. Here's what the author says about this. In the case of hostile criticism, the feedback is encased in aggression. Unlike most nonverbal and indirect criticism, the aggressive content is obvious and it's open. People may invade your personal space. They may tower over you. They may assume an aggressive posture, increase the volume of their voice, and attempt to stare you down. In terms of the content, the criticism is likely to be directed at you rather than at your behavior. You're incompetent rather than you made a mistake. It can be exaggerated and absolute. You never get anything right. It can be designed to hurt you rather than to communicate. You are a terrible parent, where the title parent is chosen specifically because it is so important to you. And this is the style that you most often think of in terms of criticism. I think if you're never really thought about criticism before, it may not have really dawned on you just how much this indirect criticism and this nonverbal criticism is in our lives. I think in my work week that I probably, of the criticism I see during the week, I would probably guess 70-80% of it is nonverbal and indirect. And then maybe 10-20% in a given week might be more of this hostile criticism, and not always directed at me, but that I see in my life or around other people. And we will come back to that in just a bit. The last one that he mentions is one that is much easier to find those gold nuggets in your life, and that is direct criticism. That is criticism that is very open, very direct, and is not particularly aggressive. It can be a little bit aggressive, but it doesn't have to be aggressive. This is the criticism that can sometimes dip into the assertive state. That assertive state where we are respecting another person's view as well as expressing our own. We have mutual respect for everyone involved, but this can also be a very aggressive, very emotional, very vague type of comments in our lives. Can be inaccurate, unreasonable expectations, but it can also be very direct. So you made a mistake when you did your presentation today. The clothes weren't washed properly. The author mentions this one. You're making too many demands on me. You have to be more productive. I don't like your attitude. Those are very direct criticisms. They can also be kind of vague, and you can see how they could maybe be assertive, but many times they can also be aggressive. But like I said, that type of criticism, I think, in my own experience, is something that I can usually go away from and try to find that gold nugget in my life. It's very hard for me personally to sometimes deal with the hostile criticism. When somebody is trying to be overbearing on me, invading my space, being very rude to me, raising their voice to me, that is a much harder thing for me to find those gold nuggets. And quite frankly, many times I totally miss the nonverbal and the indirect criticism until I started studying more of this, and I can pick this up. And quite frankly, I don't always know what some of those gold nuggets are in those areas unless you really confront the person who's doing that type of stuff. Sometimes it may be obvious that you can look back and think, oh, I may have been doing this and maybe I'll do it differently next time. But you can't please everybody at the same time either. Those are the most vague types of criticism, and without a lot more information, you may never be able to find many gold nuggets with those types of criticism. You may just have to leave it where it's at and say, okay, they frowned at me during that meeting, and we're going to learn that maybe you might want to say something about that, but if they don't communicate back with you, then basically you just have to kind of leave it and move on. And to me, again, I guess I try to think of that silver lining on the clouds. To me, the gold nugget in that point would be if they're not communicating with me, then I'm going to move on, and that's my gold nugget. I'm not going to sit there and waste my time trying to analyze and dissect this situation because they're not talking to me, and the gold nugget is that, wow, I'm not going to spend a lot of time wasting away on something that doesn't matter and that they're not willing to build relationships over. Now, that quote from Theodore Roosevelt is so interesting and good. I want to read it again. He says, "It is not the critic who counts, not the man who points out how the strong man stumbles or where the doer of deeds could have done them better. The credit belongs to the man who is actually in the arena, whose face is marred by dust and sweat and blood, who strives valiantly, who errs, who comes short again and again, because there is no effort without error and shortcoming. But this man does not actually strive to do the deeds, who knows great enthusiasms, the great devotions, who spends himself in a worthy cause, who at the best knows in the end the triumph of high achievement, and who at the worst, if he fails, at least fails while daring greatly, so that his place shall never be with those cold and timid souls who know neither victory nor defeat. People back in those days always had very interesting quotes and thought very deeply about stuff, and also had very long run-on sentences as well, but very, very great quote. Now, before we talk about a few strategies for dealing with criticism, let's talk about how a lot of people instead react to criticism, things that aren't always the best way of doing it. The first thing is fear. We can, again, be so dominated by the fear of failure, the fear of rejection, that we will just sit there and often take it, or we will internalize it because we don't have any sense of who we are. We have no sense of identity. Some of us can lash out in anger, and we can either fume inside, we can fume to people and rant to them after the ordeal, especially if we're dealing with a boss or somebody like that, or we can explode while we're there and start retaliating. How dare they say that to me? And we can stew over that for days. I can't believe they said that to me. Because again, we kind of draw this circle around ourselves and play Lord of the Ring, and we are the center of the universe many times, and how dare they say that to me? And then we will stew over that for days. Sometimes we will counterattack. We will start arguing with them. Instead of ending the conflict, we will usually make it worse. We will extend it. We will start countering it. Maybe we start attacking them and blaming them. And again, I can definitely fall more on the passive style of communication in my past, but I have done this a few times. I don't know if you've ever felt attacked, even if you more dominant passive style, and there's certain things that just kind of set you off, and you started attacking as well. You started going after the person that was coming after you. And if that's something you've ever experienced at least once in your life, when was the last time you've ever resolved anything doing it that way? Especially if that is your mode of operation, especially for people that may be more aggressive, maybe kind of more passive aggressive too. You're just doing it more quietly. Usually counterattacking just doesn't do anything, doesn't make anything better. Sometimes our counterattack can almost be denial too. We try to justify ourselves. Well, that isn't what happened. I'm going to set the record straight. And sometimes the counterattack can be that we say, no, you're not right. You always get everything wrong. See, there's the counterattack. We deny it. No, you're wrong. But then we attack them. You never get anything right. You never can see things the way they really are. You always exaggerate. You always go overboard in how you interpret things. In fact, I've told you about my experiment to be less and less on email and to shorten my email responses to people. And the whole incident that I mentioned that last week where someone attacked me through email and criticized me through email, this was something that I started doing in my response. I started writing, no, you misunderstood this, and you have a tendency to kind of overstate what happens many times. I started putting that in there. It was a denial and a counterattack at the same time. And basically all this revolves around is defending ourselves, this temptation to defend ourselves. Now, as the author mentions, there are some circumstances that saying something in our own defense is very appropriate. And I'm not going to give you a formula for when that is, but just to say that there are times in our lives that we should defend ourselves, and we should say this is really the case. But let me read this from the author. If this is our approach all of the time, it does have a detrimental impact. And this is what the author says about this. Once you have offered your defense, who has the power at that point? Now, think about this. I'm not reading from the book just yet. Again, think about when you defend yourself, are you really in charge? Are you really having the power, or who has it? This is what the author says. Who has the power? The other person does, because they determine whether your defense is good enough. I'm still not satisfied with your explanation. Squirm some more for me. Defending ourselves actually invites this type of response because it implies that you are willing to have them pass judgment on your behavior. And my friends, that is something to think seriously about if we are going to defend ourselves. Basically, if someone accuses us of something and we defend ourselves, we are basically giving them the right to be judge and jury over our lives. We've said this a couple of weeks now and said this in numerous episodes, but many times when people approach us about something, we feel this insatiable need to respond, to justify ourselves. This is the most uncanny thing I've seen with things like email and texting. In fact, I've been trying my best with my daughter to try to explain this concept. because there are times when she maybe isn't on the goods with some of her friends, as teenage girls are raised and they have little spats about this or that, or someone texts her and she doesn't really want to talk to them at the time, but then she does it anyway. And I'm asking her, why do you feel the need that if someone sends you a text that you have to respond right away? They don't know. I mean, sure, who cares if they see that it's been read? But that doesn't necessarily mean that you were at your phone at that time, or even if you read it, why do you feel the need you have to respond right then? There's this psychological bent that we have in our society today because of this instant access to people by email and texting, that we feel that you must respond at that very minute. And I still remember the good old days when you actually mailed someone pencil and paper, pen and paper, and you stuck it in the mailbox and it traveled for many days before it got to someone. Nobody expected that you respond at that very minute, because the only thing you could do back in those days was to actually pick up a phone and call someone. And even back in those days, we had answering machines, and people got very used to letting an answering machine pick up or someone take a message for someone, and I will return your call later. We didn't feel this insatiable need that the phone is ringing, therefore we must pick it up. But for some reason, when now we have these smartphones that actually can go anywhere that we go. See, before we had a limitation. If someone called me at my house, well, if I'm not at my house, I can't answer it. I'm sorry, I'm away. The answering machine can pick it up. But now I have a phone that goes everywhere I go. Into the bathroom, while I'm shopping, while I'm eating, while I'm at work, while I'm traveling. And we don't get the message that we have a limitation. We don't have to answer this thing. And why am I on this rant? Well, it goes back again to this idea of defense. I think many times we don't have to defend ourselves, especially when we realize that many times when we defend ourselves, it's giving the other person power over our lives. And they attack us, and the natural tendency for many of us is to defend ourselves and to justify ourselves. Well, this is the reason why it happened. This is what happened. And we basically give them the power to come back and say, that's not good enough. That's not a good reason for that. And we'll talk in just a minute about maybe some things that you can do instead. And in fact, let's move into that right now, because we're already going pretty long into this episode again, and I want to go over some of these techniques in more detail, and there's quite many of them. And this is a pretty long chapter in this particular book. First suggestion that the author gives is to relax. Before you respond to any criticism, relax as much as you can possibly do. Breathe very deeply, very slowly. Check your body language. Are you all tight? Are you, as Vanessa talks about, are you kind of crunched over? Are you taking less space? Maybe you need to take more space. You need to unclench your hands, especially if they're in a fist. That's not something you want to do. Release any kind of tension in your face and your body. The second thing he mentions is to avoid retaliation. Don't immediately, if someone's criticizing you, no matter the approach, don't immediately turn the focus on to them. And somebody says something to you and you say, well, last week you did the same thing, and that's turning the focus to them. Stay with the topic as hard as it is. Stay with the topic, even if you know that the other person has done the same thing or done something even worse than you did. Avoid that temptation to basically turn it around on them and be an aggressive person, because that's basically what's happening. You are being an aggressive style of communicator if you're trying to turn it back onto them. Another suggestion to do in this case is to hold back. And I find this to be a great technique, maybe a little bit easier for a passive style communicator to move over into this style of assertiveness, but not always. As the author mentions, a lot of times the intention of criticism, especially indirect criticism, maybe hostile criticism, is to get some type of reaction, to get a rise out of you, to get you to say something, to react, to cower before you or to cower before them. And one strategy to deal with that is just to not deal with it, to not give them that power, to not give them what they're wanting. And so you simply ignore their nasty face or their offensive comment, or you sit there in silence as they are ranting about something. And I will tell you from experience that it's hard to do. This is a very hard technique to pull off, but it will usually drive the other person absolutely crazy. If the other person is ranting and raving and you just sit and look at them in silence, it will really drive them crazy because they want that response from you. That is the fuel for their fire. When you respond to them and you start arguing back, or you start saying something, or you start doing things, it is like coal to the fire. They want you to toss more coal onto their fire. And when you just sit there and look at them and don't respond, it makes them feel very uncomfortable, very insecure. And sometimes it can really remove a very hostile reaction that they're giving to you. It just doesn't give them that pleasure of fueling their fire. Another thing the author mentions is to not demand perfection, and that is cut people some slack. Now, this is very hard as well. We're not saying anything that's very easy. This is one of the hardest techniques, I think, to deal with or to learn, is dealing with negative feedback. The fact is, people aren't perfect, and they're not very good at providing feedback. They're not very good at providing what we'll talk about next week, very constructive feedback. People are much more used to dealing with things critically in less than ideal ways. And as such, they are very often to deal more with the person rather than the behavior. So many times if somebody criticizes you, they will focus on you instead of what you did. Now, where we can make the gold nugget out of that is to do a little bit more work with the criticism that's coming to us. Yes, if they were a better communicator, they would have focused on what we did instead of our behavior. But now that they have attacked me as a person, I can go the extra mile if I want to and reframe that through the proper filter. So I can take their mirror, their distorted carnival mirror of me, and I can straighten it out into a regular mirror and say, okay, what would have this sounded like had they phrased it as a behavior that I did instead of me as a person? So they attacked me as a person, said I was ignorant, I was stupid because I did this and I did that. Now, how would have this sounded if they had been a better communicator? How would this have sounded if they had focused on what I did rather than who I was as a person? And that's a very valuable technique that you can learn, is to sit there and honestly, I've done this before with people. People are in front of me and they're saying things to me and it's hurting. It's not feeling very good. And I will stop myself and say, listen, what you have in front of you right now, Brandon, is a very insecure person who doesn't communicate very well. This person is a lousy communicator. Now, let me pretend that this is a very good communicator, a person who understands assertiveness, who understands how to properly communicate negative things. What would it sound like? Can I reframe what this person is saying to pretend like they're this person so I can see where that gold nugget is? And I don't demand perfection because I know that most people in this world really suck when it comes to doing this type of thing. And therefore, I don't place an unbearable standard on people. I just know that most people aren't good at this. Therefore, I have to do a little bit more extra work to actually reframe what they're saying in a way that I can understand what they were trying to say, or at least look for a gold nugget. Even if they have a really bad intention and they are very hostile, very aggressive to me, is there any merit in what they say and how would it sound like? Anyway, I hope that helps. I think it's a very cool technique to actually use. Sometimes actually saying something, now the comment I said earlier about not saying anything, you have to use that very sparingly and be very cautious and not treat everything like that. Especially for some of my passive style of communicators, that can be an excuse to never deal with anything. So I'm just never going to say anything. And no, sometimes you need to say something, and many times maybe you should. So use that technique of never saying anything very carefully. Many times I find that it's very helpful to diffuse situations if you actually say something. But what you say is very important. One of those is just simply a simple statement validating their perception that, oh, I can see why you may think that way. I can see how you think that. You're not necessarily saying that they're right. You're just saying, oh, okay, I understand how you might feel that way. You can validate their emotions. Wow, I can see that you're really upset by this. I'm sorry for that. Oh, I see you're really concerned about this. You're just validating what they're feeling, what their perception is, what they're saying. You're not saying that you agree with them. You just say that you can understand where they're coming from. I can see why you're so upset about this, and I'm sorry about that. You're not saying that you're right about that. I'm totally wrong. That's not how you're responding to that. Now, one thing we talked about in many, many episodes about this dealing with criticism in life, and this is a technique you have to be careful with because it can become a passive-aggressive style of communication. But sometimes you can agree in part. Doesn't mean you have to agree all of the time. But if there's something in what they say that you can agree with in part, then that is a great way to handle criticism. Sometimes even agreeing just in general can often shut the other person up. So, for instance, it is true that I'm quite human and I make mistakes. I think that most of us are in that arena of life. I am not perfect and I will mess up. That is a truth in life. And so if someone comes to me and they start saying, you just did a terrible job on this and I'm really disappointed in your work, then I might totally diffuse the situation just by agreeing in part with them. You're right. I do sometimes make goofy mistakes. And that will often throw the conversation very hard for that person because it's now I seem like I'm agreeing with them, but I didn't really agree with them. I'm agreeing with a general principle in life that, yeah, sometimes I make mistakes. You're right. I do sometimes make some goofy mistakes. That is a general statement that the other person may actually hear as agreeing with their cause. And many times it may just cause them to shut up or to move on with something. And again, you have to be careful with this technique because this technique can come across very passive-aggressively. It could be a form of manipulation if you're not careful with it, but it is a useful technique to be aware of in life. Sometimes just allowing people just to have their say Again, listening before you say something. Now, I said a minute ago that sometimes just not saying anything can be a rare technique you use. It can be effective at times, but sometimes just taking a second breath before you respond to something because you find out that the person really isn't finished. Here's what the author says about this. Before you respond, allow critics to voice their points completely. Listen. Eventually, they will slow down and be more prepared for an open exchange. If you jump in with your response too quickly, they will feel blocked and their emotional tone will usually escalate. Listening to criticism does not mean that you have to buy it or believe it. You take the criticism in, but you don't necessarily take it on. This goes again back to that I don't have to receive this as who I am and my identity. I don't have to internalize it just because I'm listening to it. There's a lot of things we listen to and it doesn't affect us and make us who we are. Criticism is the same thing. We deceive ourselves by feeling that emotional rush of fear and condemnation and guilt to think that we are receiving it, and then we start receiving it, but we don't have to. You can push it away very easily. Asking for some type of clarification, asking for people to be more specific is a very good thing to do as well. So you seem really upset today. Can you tell me a little bit more about exactly why? I don't think I'm understanding the specifics of why you're upset. Or the author mentions this one. He says, I do make mistakes sometimes. Which one are you most concerned with right now, though? Now, when you ask for clarification, especially if it's indirect or nonverbal, if someone frowns at you, you can ask them why. You don't look very happy. Is there any particular reason why you kind of look like you frowned there for a minute? Is everything okay? Is there anything you wanted to say about that? And that's a very useful technique too. But you've got to realize the fact is that someone does this, they may deny that they did it, or they may simply refuse to tell you why they did it. And that is their right. Part of being assertive is you've got to give people the right, the dignity to respond how they're going to respond. You cannot control other people's behavior, and certainly you cannot force them to be open with you and tell you what they're thinking. You can invite that opportunity, but if they don't respond, you've got to just move on with your life. Another cool technique is to explain without offering excuses. If it's appropriate, you may wish to give a brief explanation for something that happened in your life, but you don't have to offer it as an excuse, and you don't have to go on some long explanation of this, some justification. The author mentions this one, I'm sorry I missed that call. It was my day off, period. Move on. You don't go into some elaborate thing, I'm sorry, it won't ever happen again. No, you just explain if you feel it's appropriate. Here's another one the author gives. You're right. I did forget that. It was very busy Tuesday. Short explanation, you go on with your life. You don't go into some lengthy thing. As he mentions in the book, I know I forgot to call you on your birthday, but blank and blank and blank and blank happened, and then blank happened, and then blank happened. It's just, you don't do that kind of stuff. And many of us do this. We have these long strings of excuses to communicate very lack of confidence in our own lives. We invite that critic to challenge us and to basically chip away at what we're saying. We think that offering multiple excuses is actually going to strengthen our cause, and many times it actually weakens our cause. And our biggest thing is to, first of all, maybe not even offer an excuse, to not justify something. Yeah, I'm sorry, I did make a mistake on that, and leave it there. Or if you feel a real need to say, yeah, I did make a mistake on that. It was a very rough day that day, and just leave it there and not go into all of these crazy details. Another cool technique, don't try to change their mind. Here's what the author says about this. You can't control what others think. They have a right to their opinion, even if they are mistaken. Let me say that again. They have a right to their opinion, even if they are mistaken. If you try to force them to change, you hand them the power. Don't keep justifying. Don't keep explaining. Don't keep arguing endlessly until they agree with you. They may never agree with you. They don't have to, and you don't need them to. Even in the odd case, when it seems you do need them to agree with you, perhaps at work, you can't force them to do so. So quit wasting your time trying to change someone's mind. It's a complete waste of time. Now, here's a very unusual technique the author mentions. Thank the critic. Thank them for their feedback, even if it was bad, even if it was negative. Now, that can be a very hard thing to do. And quite frankly, sometimes I'm very challenged on this particular technique, but I've learned it, and it's a very unusual technique in how it does typically change things. Consider thanking people even if you didn't ask for the feedback, even if it wasn't given in a very pleasant, nice style to you, even if there was no intention of acting according to their advice. If someone says something to you and you know there's no way I'm going to do what you're saying, I'm not going to internalize that, I'm not going to even think about this after you've told me this, I'm forgetting it altogether, it's complete rubbish in my life, still consider thanking them. Thank you very much for what you told me. And you'll find that gratitude, that attitude of gratitude can take you very far in life. It can make things a lot better in life. Even if you don't agree with them, even if you have no intention of following their advice, you can thank them for that. And I practiced this last week myself. The very situation I was telling you about, it happened to be that person turned around to me very much a few days later and told me that I'm sorry, I didn't really respond to you in the best way. I probably was a little bit overboard in how I responded to you. And I still later that day thanked them for giving me the advice. I said, well, I realize what you told me, but I still want to thank you for what you did tell me, because it made me think about some issues a little bit differently, and how I really do want to abbreviate, much more of my emails and just deal with people more face to face. And I thank them for that. Now, I don't agree with 90% of what they told me, to be honest with you. I don't agree with nearly everything they told me. And I think that 100% of how they responded to me was bad. It wasn't a very effective style of communication. But again, I filtered that. It took me a day to do that. I will tell you the truth. It was not an immediate thing, but it took me a day to reframe what they said in a more positive light and think, okay, this person really doesn't communicate very well in this area. So what would it have sounded like if a very positive person had communicated this to me? Oh, it would have sounded like this. And yeah, I can see a point there. And so I could turn to that person, as inferior as they were in telling me this, and thank them for their advice. A very pathetic attempt at advice, I will tell you. A very critical, aggressive style of communication, totally inappropriate as far as I'm concerned. But I could reframe that into how a more productive, positive person would have said it to me, picked out the gold nugget, and gone back to that person who did it completely wrong and say, thank you for your advice. Now, that's a great way to live life. My friends, I'm telling you, for me, this is a long, long journey to learn this. And I'm still learning this. I'm telling you something that happened in my life last week that was a big stumbling block for me. And I'm still learning this, but I'm telling you, this is a really great way, I think, of living life, of living in a way that is more productive and more pushing us again to our passion and our creativity. And let's go ahead and end this episode today, because I've gotten very long-winded here. But as we do, there's one other thing I wanted to quote from the book, some common types of criticism and some sample responses. So first of all, he gives what are some unhelpful responses to a criticism, and then what he considers to be better responses. So as you listen, see if you can pick up some of the techniques we talked about, some of the bad ways of responding to criticism, some of the better ways of responding to criticism. So here's the criticism that you've been given. Maybe this came through an email. Maybe someone told you this directly face to face. You've been doing sloppy work and goofing off lately. That's the criticism. So how are some bad ways of responding to this? Here's one. No, I haven't. I've been 100% organized and productive. Defensive. Here's another one. Well, you aren't such a great worker either. See, that's reflecting it back to that other person. Here's one. Oh, but I had that dental appointment last week, and then there was the Johnson project, and you remember the fire alarm on Tuesday, and besides, Frank is in the next office hasn't finished his part yet. This is trying to justify and excuse everything. So what are some better responses? How about this one? I can understand that you might think that way. It's acknowledging what they're saying. It's not agreeing that they're right. It's just saying, I understand where you're coming from. How about this one? Can you give me an example? So that's taking vague criticism and asking for something more specific. What's bothering you the most at the moment? Again, a plea to get away from vague statements to something more specific. You're right. I have been a bit sloppy this week. That's an agreement in part. That's saying that, yeah, there's probably some truth to that. I don't say you're 100% right, but yeah, maybe there's some there. And I'm going to diffuse the whole situation by agreeing with you, and therefore there's no argument. There's nothing more to talk about. Can you tell me what you'd like me to do differently? And there's an attempt to try to build relationships and, again, move towards something specific. So I hope that this has helped today. Very tricky topic, very hard topic, quite honestly. This isn't something that's easy, and definitely not something I feel I've mastered by any sense of the word. But it's something that I've learned bits here and there, tricks that have worked for me. Would love to hear if something's worked for you, something that really helps you dealing with criticism, that's not aggressive, not passive aggressive, but really is respectful of everyone in that situation and would be considered assertive styles of dealing with criticism. Let me know. Would love to hear any comments you have on this at firstthingsproductivity.com/4141. And you can leave me comments there. You can leave me voicemail. Would love to hear of any tips and tricks you come up with. You can also tell me on Twitter. You can let me know on Facebook as well. Would love to know anything like that. As always, please consider leaving me any rating. If you're new to the show, would love to have a rating from you, comment on iTunes, on Stitcher, anywhere that you're listening to me at, except, of course, my own website. If you're listening to me on my own website, then I would just love to hear some feedback from you. So you can go all the way down to the bottom of the page where you're listening to me and let me know your comments. So until next time, remember this. You are not a mirror to simply shine the radiance of other people in this world. And other people come to you in criticism with a very distorted mirror image of who you are. It's again like those carnival mirrors. It's distorted and it's not really who you are. So don't internalize it. Don't make it part of your identity. But at the same time, realize even as distorted as it is, there might be the smallest granular truth there or smallest granular treasure there if you just look at it. Consider taking very inferior communication styles that people come to you and reframing those in a way of how a very good communicator would have said that to you, and see if there's some positive angle you can make out of a very negative, critical moment that someone has imposed on your life. Embrace today with passion and intention, and don't die with your music still inside you.